Hello, and welcome to the Sustainability Leaders Podcast, part of the Jobs with Impact compendium of resources for people who want to make a positive impact on the world. I'm David Rosenheim, your host. Every week, we bring you in-depth conversations with people who are leading the way to a sustainable future. I hope these conversations will be as inspiring to you as they are to me, and most of all, I hope that they'll empower you to take action. The planet needs you. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to jobswithimpact.com. This episode is part of the California Leadership Series, where we focus on changemakers in California government who are shaping the most innovative energy and climate policy anywhere, transforming the world's fifth largest economy and beyond. Our sustainable business sponsor for the California Leadership Series is Lyft. Lyft is the fastest growing rideshare company in the U.S. and is available to 95% of the U.S. population. Lyft is preferred by drivers and passengers for its reliable and friendly experience and its commitment to effecting positive change for the future of our cities as the first rideshare company to launch a carbon offset program. And now, all Lyft rides are carbon neutral. To learn more, visit lyft.com/carbon. Hello, folks. Before we get started with today's guest, I want to go on a little rant about the IPCC's new report. The IPCC is the International Panel on Climate Change. It's the scientific panel that was set up in 1988 under the auspices of the United Nations in order to provide us with an objective, scientific view of climate change. Thousands of scientists contribute to and review the IPCC's periodic reports, which, because they are subject to the line-by-line review of more than 120 countries' delegates, tend to be conservative in their claims about climate change prognosis and impacts. The IPCC, along with Al Gore, won the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize for its work. The group has been criticized by many for being too conservative and by some for not being conservative enough, but as far as a global scientific consensus on where we are with global warming, it's pretty much the best we have. Well, like it or not, the IPCC has issued a new report following its early October 2018 meeting in Incheon, Korea. The report, which references 6,000 scientific works, is really the best guidance we have on the current state of climate change and tells us that we have no more than 12 years to begin a significant drawdown of global emissions. Carbon pollution would have to be cut by 45% by the year 2030 in order to keep global warming from exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius, and emissions would have to be at net zero by the year 2050. This goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius is increasingly being recognized as necessary to avoid dangerous levels of warming. The report identifies the likely differences in terms of impacts between a 1.5 and a 2 degree future. These differences are in many cases quite substantial. The good news is that we have much of the technology and all of the source energy in the form of wind and the giant thermonuclear reactor in the sky we call the sun at our fingertips. The question is really one of political will, and political will comes down to voters. Regardless of political persuasion, we must demand that climate action be the priority from those who are supposed to be representing us. And that's at the local level, the state level, and the federal level. I encourage everyone listening to read at least the summary of the IPCC report, take action, and spread the word. The report comes at an opportune time, at least in terms of this podcast, as this week's guest is Ken Alex, the Executive Director of California Governor Brown's Office of Planning and Research. OPR is the state's strategic planning facility for land use, and it is the clearinghouse for much of the state's environmental goal setting, monitoring, and funding. In his tenure leading OPR, which has been the longest in the agency's history, Ken has doubled and tripled down on the issue of climate change. One of his marquee accomplishments has been the formation of the Under 2 Coalition, a group of state and regional governments with a signed commitment to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius that began with just 2 states, California, and the German state of Baden-Württemberg, and has now swelled to include 220 governments who represent over 1.3 billion people and 43% of the global economy. All of this is due in no small part to the vision and dogged determination of Ken Alex. Before joining the governor's office, Ken was the Senior Assistant Attorney General heading the Environment Section of the California Attorney General's office and the co-head of the office's Global Warming Unit. I got to know Ken during my time with the Climate Registry, where he was always generous and helpful in advising me on our strategy. I had the pleasure of seeing him in action at UN climate conferences in Lima, Paris, and Marrakesh. And it was great to sit down with Ken in Sacramento in the run-up to the Global Climate Action Summit in September and get a sense of his priorities in these final months of the Brown administration. So Ken, Alex, thanks for joining the podcast.
My pleasure.
I'd like to start sort of early back in your career, or maybe even before your career, if you can talk about what was sort of your first spark of environmentalism.
Well, I guess it goes back to being pretty young. My parents took us to national parks pretty much every year when we were kids, and I feel like I've had some connection, particularly to the outdoors, for all my life, and probably instilled pretty much from my parents. So, that creates an ethic and a feeling and a real connection, and I feel that today as well.
And I know that you studied at UC Santa Cruz, and you studied political theory.
Yes, to both.
What was that experience like? What did that do for your awakening consciousness?
I would say it taught me a lot about how to think and to how to question things, and really the coursework and the professors at Santa Cruz. A lot of it is based on discussion groups. At least it used to be when I was there long ago, and not to or to try to understand sort of the underlying sense of why decisions are made in society, how things are structured, how they might be different, what's the sense of how what's political, what used to be political in varied societies, particularly Greek and Roman and that sort of thing, and how we've moved away from that and really promoted the idea that individuals are the most important thing as opposed to communities. And so that was part of it, and another part of my education was around thinking about institutions. So it's somewhat ironic that I've worked in the state for many, many years, but I have a strong interest in thinking about institutions and how they form and conform and reform behavior and impact people's thought. So it's something that I think about a fair amount, and it applies in a lot of different circumstances.
And what was that experience like, the law school experience?
Law school itself, I wasn't a huge fan of law school. Part of it was tied up in the fact that I worked about 20 or 30 hours a week because I needed to earn some money to pay the tuition, even though it's a lot less than it is now. And then I can't say that I loved Boston. I thought it was cold and fairly racist. It probably is less probably on both counts now. And I also kind of it's law school is 3 years because it's partially about training you how to think in a different way than you might have before. And took me a while to recognize that instead of fighting it, you really need to learn it. and then you don't lose your entire ability to critique things. But you can leave that aside while you actually learn how to be a lawyer. And once I understood that, I did better with it. But the study of law is less interesting to me than the study of political theory.
And did you spend any time in private practice, or did you go straight into?
I had 2 summers during law school. The first summer I clerked at a public interest entity called the National Center for Youth Law. And then the second summer, I worked for a law firm in Washington, D.C. that actually, interestingly enough, given my current job, looked at rate setting for utilities around the country. And so I had, some experience with that. And then, of course, before law school, as I mentioned, I worked as a paralegal in a law firm. But when I graduated from law school, I clerked at the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals for 2 years. And after that, I went to the Attorney General's office.
So was that sort of always your intention to go into public service in the application of law? I would guess that many of your colleagues at Harvard Law School did the exact opposite.
In part, the experience working in a law firm as a paralegal was very helpful. I had no interest whatsoever in working for, standard law firm. There are law firms that do specialized practice that, might have been interesting. But just being in a general practice of law or in a large law firm had no appeal to me. So I would say, and also in a lot of ways, wasn't that important to me to practice law. I did for many years and I enjoyed it, but the public interest aspect of public service and, working on public issues was kind of more the driving force.
So, as you mentioned, you spent many years in the California Attorney General's office, working on the environmental portfolio primarily. Was that always the case, or did you migrate to that after working on other issues?
So I was hired directly into the environment section of the Attorney General's office. And I was there for 25 years. By the end of it, I was in charge of the environment section. The only time that and even during that time, I remained in the environment section, but I was also the head of the, what was at that point called the Energy Task Force. It had to do with the energy crisis in California and trying to get money back for ratepayers and dealing with Enron and all of that. So, and that actually took about 6 years of my time. And even when I left, it was still going.
What role, just in your tenure at the AG office, what role did climate play? I imagine at the beginning it probably wasn't as big of a deal, perhaps as it became. How did it sort of filter into the priorities and the day-to-day work?
I started at the Attorney General's office in 1985, so it was well before any mainstream notion of climate change and the potential for it. Probably a good 10 years before it even was much on the radar screen. I was interested in it. I actually I remember taking an oceanography class at Berkeley and having a discussion about climate change, and the professor being dubious that it was real, but concerned because the potential for impact was quite significant. And that started me thinking about it quite a bit more, and I think I started thinking about it fairly early on. And so I was in a position to bring the issue forward a bit. We started thinking about whether under California Environmental Quality Act, whether it should be a topic that should be considered. And so I think we came to the issue fairly early in the 1990s, comparatively early. And, over the course of my career in the Attorney General's office, I think the Attorney General's office in California took a very significant leadership role and handled a lot of the cutting-edge litigation around climate change in the late 90s, early noughts.
Okay, so here we are in the Office of Planning and Research, fast-forwarding several years. And maybe we'll circle back to some of the AG experience as well. But talk about your role and really what OPR does and your role within it.
So I'm the director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, which is not self-descriptive. Nobody knows. I sometimes...
It seems very secretive, actually.
I sometimes joke the Office of Planning and Research does the 5-year grain harvesting plans, like we're the Soviet Union or something. It like a lot of things in California, it actually started under Ronald Reagan. He signed it into existence, and also like a lot of things, it grew and kind of came to fruition under Jerry Brown Part 1 in the mid to late 70s. And it's part of the governor's office. Its focus has been primarily on land use and liaison with local governments. Of the California Environmental Quality Act, it runs the CEQA clearinghouse. And so that's a statutory function. It has a few other statutory functions that nobody knows about, it's the military liaison for the state, and it's got a tribal liaison role. So when it's very much dependent on who's governor and what that governor wants the office to do. In particular, when I got here, Governor Schwarzenegger had fairly specifically said that he didn't think much of the Office of Planning and Research. I think he didn't know what to do with it, but I had some history with it because at the Attorney General's office, I'd worked quite a lot on CEQA matters, and so I was quite aware that it worked on CEQA and had a role. And so I spent some time looking at some of the statutory provisions that help create the office, and I realized that there hadn't been an update of the CEQA guidelines for many years, and that the office also has a role in developing and publishing the general plan guidelines. I saw it as a place that had significant potential to work on cross-cutting issues. One of the real strengths of the Office of Planning and Research, because it's part of the governor's office, it allows people to work across multiple agencies and multiple topics. There's constantly an issue in government and bureaucracies of all kind around siloing. And so part of OPR's role is to help break that down. But then if you start to think about it, climate change, just about every aspect of climate change can be thought of through the lens of land use. And so a lot of what we've decided to do is to look at land use-based issues for climate. And then some of it is, of the work that we do, is driven by the talents and interests of the people who we've hired. Just as an example, we have a medical doctor who also has a public policy degree, and so she's really brought the issue of health and climate and land use together in some interesting ways, and so we try to do some of that.
To what extent and I'd love you to talk about how we've talked about it before, your process of appointment and how you actually came to OPR. sort of a part B to that question, you mentioned that different governors have seen different roles for OPR. To what extent does Governor Brown directly influence your agenda versus that being a collaborative or more of a bottom-up?
Well, I'll say Governor Brown has given me quite a bit of leeway to develop an agenda. Obviously, whenever he or cabinet, wants something in particular, we jump to it and are happy to do so. I will say that, he's been very supportive of hiring staff to based on the quality of the staff, I would say, and then to integrate their skills and talents and interests into what we're doing. And he's consistent with his priorities. He's really let me define a lot of the work that we do here, and circle back and make sure that it's working for him and that we're being responsive. But overall, really has given me a fair amount of leash to do what was in the statute and then to do other things as well.
So going back to part A of the question, related to your own appointment and just the appointment process, I guess, in general for those that aren't familiar with it.
Well, it differs with different governors. The Office of Planning and Research, as I said, is part of the governor's office. So everybody in the governor's office, unlike most of the government, is at-will employees. They're not part of the civil service. So it has a little different hiring process. During the transition from one administration to the next, the transition folks work on potential people to fill various positions. I was part of the transition team. Governor Brown's team was pretty small. And they weren't quite sure, some of the folks on the transition team weren't quite sure what to do with the Office of Planning and Research. And, because I had some history with it, I was interested in it, and I thought it would be an interesting place to be. And the governor agreed and let me be the director. I got to know him when I was at the Attorney General's office. He was the Attorney General for my last 4 years there. And so I'm grateful for that opportunity.
So as you look, as you know, this podcast is focused both on sustainability, but also careers as we're talking about yours. So as you look across the various sectors that affect climate and environment, from water to land use to advanced transportation to energy, where do you see the hotspots being in terms of opportunities and job creation now and sort of in the years to come?
Well, unfortunately, climate change is a job creator, I think, ultimately. We've seen in California significant number of jobs created around renewable energy. That is going to continue. Transportation represents 50% of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in California. We have to deal with that. And that has already spawned multiple new or revised industries. We have Tesla as a good example. I think autonomous vehicles are going to revolutionize transportation for good or for bad, depending on policy and how we handle it. And I think you see things like blockchain and various software developments. I think these can very much be relevant to climate change and potential for solutions. So everywhere, and let me add one other, which is I think it's going to be more and more essential that we sequester carbon, whether it's through direct capture of carbon or through sequestration in soils or cement or other forum. And I think those are going to create quite a number of opportunities and probably also create some new industries as well.
A special thanks to our sustainable business sponsor for the California Leadership Series, Lyft. Lyft is the fastest growing rideshare company in the U.S. and is available to 95% of the U.S. population. Now, all Lyft rides are carbon neutral. This means that a decision to ride with Lyft is a decision to take a cleaner option, cleaner than driving yourself or riding with another company, and will fund efforts that are reducing emissions and combating climate change. This is a multi-million-dollar investment in the first year alone, which makes Lyft one of the top voluntary purchasers of carbon offsets in the world. In year one, Lyft anticipates offsetting over 1 million tons of carbon, equivalent to planting tens of millions of trees or taking hundreds of thousands of cars off the road. Lyft's investment and impact will continue to grow as the company does. Ride Lyft and join together in effecting positive change for the future of our cities. To learn more, visit lyft.com/carbon. So coming back to OPR and your work here, you and I have had a chance to intersect in some of the international work. And this is, maybe a surprising role for a state to play. I mean, California has really emerged as almost a nation state, at least in terms of diplomacy and partnership making around climate change specifically. And that role has emerged and evolved over time. You are credited as being one of the architects of the Under 2 Coalition. Can you talk a bit about that and set it within the context of California's international climate work generally?
So, it's kind of hard to realize, but California is now the 5th largest economy in the world. So
it keeps climbing the ranks.
Correct.
Yeah.
So you've got the United States, China, Japan, Germany, California. Every other country in the world has a smaller economy. It's sort of astonishing. Having said that, California does not have a seat at the table in international negotiations around climate, like the things that lead to the Paris Agreement. And so we as a state felt, given that climate change is global, that it's very important for us to work with countries and with other subnational governments, states, regions, cities. So we thought, all right, how do we make our voice heard? And so about 3.5 years ago, Governor Brown met with the environment minister of a state called Baden-Württemberg in Germany, and they decried the same lack of voice in the international process. And the governor asked me to think about how we might work with Baden-Württemberg to change that. We drafted the Under 2 MOU, and it apparently struck a chord. In 3 years, we now have over 200 subnational governments that are part of the Under 2 Coalition. To do two things. One, to create this voice for subnational governments who want to see more aggressive action. And then I would say even more importantly, to help those governments work together to actually reduce emissions and to take climate action, and to show what's possible, not just to other subnational governments, but to countries and to the international process, so that we can be more aggressive in dealing with climate change. Having said all that, California is still a state and part of the U.S., and so our quote-unquote international work is pretty modest. We don't have a State Department. We don't have a lot of people working outside of California. There's some. We've done a fair amount of work with China, with Mexico, with a number of countries in Latin America, with India. But it's fairly modest, and there's a half a dozen or a dozen people who depending on the day and the time, work on international issues, because we're certainly cognizant that we don't interfere in international affairs in terms of diplomacy. And while California is extremely interested in international trade, most of those rules are set at the federal level.
Some people may wish that California did play a more active role, but can you talk a little bit about how the international role that California plays has changed between the Obama and Trump administrations? I mean, I think there's an expectation right now that California carry some of the work that isn't being done at the federal level.
You know, it has and it hasn't. I think it's a progression in part because California has been a leader in a lot of aspects of climate. And so as a result, you know, I think countries, companies, subnational governments are interested in interacting with California. And I think that would be true regardless of who the president is. It is somewhat different because, you know, the U.S. has pulled out or is in the process of pulling out under the Trump administration from the Paris Agreement. They've disengaged in a lot of ways from moving forward on climate issues. It's hugely important for California. We have a huge coastline. We're at the temperature gradient for our snowpack. We have forest fires, you know, massively increasing, et cetera, et cetera. We're really significantly impacted by climate change. So it's very important that California be aggressive and be ambitious, and part of that is really working with partners around the world. And I think that countries and others want to have a partnership with California, with the United States, and because California is certainly more forward right now on this set of issues, I think the response has been substantial that many, many jurisdictions want to work with the state, and we're interested and willing to do that where we can.
Has the progress of the Under 2 coalition, and actually it'd be useful for you to define Under 2, because
sure.
I know what it means, but when I look at it still, I think of the band U2. Be useful
Could be worse.
Be useful for you to define that. But I'd also like to know, has it met your expectations? Is it meeting your expectations? What do you see kind of moving forward for it?
So Under 2 has kind of two meetings. One is to, as the Paris Agreement seeks to keep warming under 2 degrees. Actually, we need to get closer to 1.5, but Under 2 is a little catchier than under 1.5. And then the other part of it is under 2 tons per capita. Again, that's related to the 2-degree goal, but if you have per capita emissions of under 2 tons, you get towards the under 2-degree goal. So they go hand in hand.
Per capita emissions are widely disparate across the world. I think in the United States it's on the order of 18 or 19. Is that
something
right?
in that range? And
California's a bit less.
About hopefully around 10 at this point, so a fair amount less.
And the developing world could be less than 1.
Yeah. Less than 1.
Yeah.
And so that's important because if you set it up as, you know, we need to reduce our emissions by 80% or 90%, well, that's important for California to do. It's important for the U.S. and other developed countries. But for places that are already below 2 tons per capita, it's unrealistic and in some ways unfair. And so we thought that having a per capita goal addressed that, because it means that developing economies can grow, but they have, without reducing their emissions, but they have to keep them within a range that makes sense for the world. So, and then what was the second part of the question?
The second part is the progress of the Under 2 coalition meeting your and the governor's expectations?
Let me give a nuanced answer to that. I think in a lot of ways, the uptake of membership or signatures has really probably exceeded our initial expectations. So at this point, represents 40% of world GDP and 1.3 or more billion people. And has a real presence. I think it's recognized now as an entity, and it really has given voice to subnational governments in a way they didn't have before. So all that's great and meets or exceeds expectations. There's another piece to this, though, and the point of it is not to be an entity that simply gathers signatures and occasionally makes a political statement. The point of it is to actually reduce emissions and to make progress and to show what's possible. So a huge challenge is, like every organization, it has been fundraising. And I think this year have really turned an initial corner and are seeing more support from foundations, from governments, various funding sources to move forward on projects, and you can feel the institution kind of becoming more solid. So that's great, and that's starting to happen. Now the difficulty is with 200, we're bigger than the United Nations. The United Nations has about 200 members, and they have a little bit bigger budget than we do, which is fair. They have one or two other items on their agenda. But we have the same or slightly more members. We have the same number of languages, different levels of economic development, different cultures, different styles. How do you mesh that? And then how do you make substantive progress? How do you even do the basic communications? These things are challenging, and we're working through them. And, I feel comfortable that we've found some governance structure and a good secretariat to help us work through those things. But there are quite significant challenges that I think are repeated in dealing with climate change more broadly, but are crystallized in an organization like this. So I think we're quite aware of the set of challenges and are figuring out ways to work through them, which has been quite interesting, I have to say.
So coming back to the idea of career and everybody that I talk to talks about what a circuitous path their career has had. And I think as we study the environmental field, there are so many pockets of opportunities. You pointed to a whole range of them before. What advice do you give to people that are just starting out and really have that, recognize the problem and have the passion to try to address the problem?
What I would say, first of all, if you have passion for this, that's fantastic. Remember that, hang on to that, and have it help you make some of your decisions. And kind of going to your point about circuitous path, have some flexibility and be open to following things that you might not have originally thought you would be interested in, and really have an open mind to what may be a possible choice. None of these choices are forever if you don't want them to be, but they may lead to things that you never would have guessed. I'll give you a quick example. I was at a dinner and I sat next to somebody who was a student who had just graduated from college, and we just started talking. We didn't know each other, and he asked me a lot about what I was doing. I talked about Office of Planning and Research, and he said, "Well, do you think I could volunteer a little bit there?" And I said, "Sure." Anyway, I had a project in mind around biochar and, kind of learning more about the potential for biochar. Well, to make a long story short, he's in graduate school working on issues around biochar. So, I think it was the openness that he had to, and he's really become one of the country's experts on biochar over the course of the past 2 or 3 years. And it just happened because he was open to exploring and, has hopefully, I'll ask him in a year or two if it was a good choice or not, but seemingly it's opening up some career opportunities for him.
Well, and to your point earlier that climate has been very good for career opportunities. Yeah. It's a river that's moving, and if you step in and show competence and curiosity, you'll find your way.
Well, the statistics, it's not what you want necessarily, but I've heard it described climate in some ways as the largest economic opportunity in history, that there needs to be about $40 to $60 trillion of investment over, the course of the next few decades. In order to move a carbon-based economy to a different basis. And so, that's one way to think about it, that it is going to create economic opportunity and different possibilities.
Can you point to a challenge or a setback in your career that stands out, and maybe how you learned from it or recovered from it?
I've been somewhat lucky. As we talked about, I've only had a few jobs since law school. This is my third. All three of them have been really pretty excellent. There have been setbacks and, cases that I probably shouldn't have done and decisions I shouldn't have made. But, on the whole, I'm not, if I'd have thought about this question before, I probably had an intelligent response. But at the moment, I'm not thinking, I feel like I've been overall in my professional life, I've been quite lucky.
What are you proudest of?
Well, I think Under 2 Coalition is high on the list. At the Attorney General's office, we help create what are now called climate action plans. That was the result of some litigation that I handled. I had some interesting cases. One had to do with Diablo Canyon and some cover-up of data and the impact of the Diablo Canyon power plant. There was kind of like a John Grisham story where I had anonymous informants and did I won't say a Mueller-like investigation, but a very complex investigation with subpoena power, and that was fascinating. Also, since I've been here at Office of Planning and Research, we've developed 3 programs under AmeriCorps that is sending now literally hundreds of recent grads to local communities to work on climate and water, and now broadband is the 3rd program. So yeah, a lot of things that have gone pretty well, and hopefully. I'll add one other thing. I've had dozens and dozens of interns and externs and students who've kind of gone through the Attorney General's office and Office of Planning and Research, and also young employees, and to see them in different places in the world, literally, working on issues that are related to the stuff they worked on when they were, working as interns and externs has been pretty great.
So in the final, what are we down to, 6 months or so of the Brown administration? I know that the The climate summit in San Francisco in September is looming large on the agenda. What are your top priorities, and what do you hope that the new administration, whoever is governor, is prioritizing?
So I have a couple of projects that really interest me that I'd like to make significant progress on before we go. The first is we're quite interested in a methane detection satellite. JPL has developed an instrument that allows remote detection of methane. We've used it in California on an airplane, and it's interesting. We've managed to detect the 300 or so largest sources of methane in the state, and representing about 40% of methane emissions. We think that can be replicated worldwide, and the most direct route to doing that is to miniaturize the instrument and put it on a satellite. We have to raise a lot of money to get that done, but I think that could be fairly game-changing. Methane's a very important short-lived climate pollutant, and there are means to address it. So before the end of the term, I'd like to see if we can get that in position to be moved forward. I've also, I saw that South Korea had started a green credit card where people would get rewards for behavior that was relevant to reducing emissions. And so I thought, 70% of the economy in the U.S. is consumers, and we don't really tap into that for climate. So I started talking to some banks about an idea around a credit card that would pay people back and for making purchases that are climate sensitive, and also for taking action themselves. And so we've been partnered with a bank and the Bren School at UC Santa Barbara, and some folks who are working on how you would do product certification. And that's moving forward, and hope to get somewhere with that as well, which I think would be great. The response has been really good. So for the next administration, the number one thing for me is I don't want some of the programs that we've been working on to be so associated with Governor Brown that the next governor feels like they can't, that it's, that was Brown's and they need to do something else. And I'll just, since we've talked a lot about Under 2, I'll use that as the example. I think it would be unfortunate if it's perceived too much as Governor Brown's program, because I think it has a status now. It has a worldwide context, but it needs California. California continues to be, the big leader on this, and I'm hoping that the next administration will recognize that, and I, hope to have the chance to really promote that idea. I think that's true. The scoping plan for AB 32, which the Air Resources Board is responsible for, I think it's an under-recognized document. It's a blueprint for the world's 5th largest economy in 12 years to reduce emissions by 40%. That's a phenomenal undertaking. We'll see if it's successful. It's not going to be without trauma. But, there'll need to be tweaks and changes, et cetera, no doubt about it. But I hope that the next administration recognizes that as a blueprint and can continue a lot of what goes back to, as Governor Brown is, careful to note, to both Democratic and Republican administrations in moving California forward on this road.
So just as we wrap up, I think the last time I saw you, maybe with one or two brief exceptions, was in the Atlas Mountains in Morocco. And where you were expressing a bit of wanderlust. I think we were all feeling it at that time.
Yeah, well, only one of us managed to get out and actually go somewhere.
Right. But what's next for Ken Alex?
I think I'm probably, after 34 years in state government, it's probably time to do something else. I've been talking with UC Santa Cruz and UC Berkeley a little bit about climate center around how do you move solutions to climate issues from research and academia into the policy world, and then how do you scale those things? I think that's one of the most difficult problems in climate. So that intrigues me. It also intrigues me to take some time off, and as you did, to recharge a bit, and hopefully somewhere in there is the next thing to do, or next set of things to do.
Well, I hope you do get a chance to take a break, and that you and I know that you will plug back in. And I want to thank you for your time today, and also for a career of incredible service and leadership on environment and sustainability.
Well, thank you. Nice to talk to you.
Thanks again to the Sustainable Business Partner for the California Leadership Series, LIFT. To learn more about LIFT's carbon neutral program, visit lift.com/carbon. The Sustainability Leaders Podcast is a resource of Jobs with Impact. Our engineer and associate producer is Ian Swanke. Theme music is also by Ian Swanke. I'm David Rosenheim. If you like the show, please rate and review us on iTunes or your preferred platform. And be sure to tell your friends and colleagues who want to make a difference. Thanks for listening. See you next week.